He stood at the door and watched her drive away. His daughter was smiling. She turned back one last time and said the words he would carry with him for the rest of his life. "Don't worry, Dad. All the people up north are good people." He waved. The van turned the corner. And just like that, she was gone. David Beck had no reason to worry. None at all. His daughter was 18, responsible, and excited about her first real work trip. Everything was fine. Everything was normal. He went back inside. He would never see her again. Her name was Berit Beck. Most people who loved her called her Barry. In Sturtevant, Wisconsin, the biggest news was usually a local football game or a neighbor's fence going up. It was the kind of town where nothing serious ever happened, and exactly the kind of town that has no idea how to handle it when something serious does. Barrett had just graduated from Case High School. He played violin in the school orchestra, and music was not just a hobby for her. It was the thread running through every plan she had for the future. College was coming. The path was not fully clear yet, but wherever it led, music was going to be in it. In the meantime, she had done something most 18-year-olds do not think to do. She got a real job, clerical work at a major company right there in Racine County. First paycheck, first professional routine, first real taste of adult life. She showed up every day without being told to. And just a few weeks in, she was picked to attend a 3-day computer training seminar in Appleton, Wisconsin, about 130 miles north. For a girl barely a month out of high school, that felt like a lot. A work trip, a hotel room, a room full of adults treating her like a colleague. She was nervous and excited and ready, all at the same time. Her parents felt it differently. David and Diane Beck supported her completely, but Appleton was not around the corner, and Barrett had never made a trip like this alone before. They helped her pack the family van, went over the route, and tried not to hover too much. Before she left, David did one last practical thing. He wrote down the van's mileage. Barrett's company had agreed to cover her travel expenses, so they needed a record of how far she drove. It was a mundane detail. A few digits on a scrap of paper meant for a reimbursement form. David did not think twice about it. He did not know it then, but he had just documented the exact moment his daughter's life was hijacked. On the morning of July 17, 1990, Barrett loaded up the van and started north. One quick stop first, her boyfriend Kurt's house. A short visit, a few words about the seminar and the hotel, and then the open road. She left his house and pointed the van toward Appleton. The most direct route passed through Fond du Lac, a mid-sized city sitting about halfway across the state. A natural stopping point, nothing unusual about it. Around noon, she pulled into the parking lot of Forest Mall in Fond du Lac and walked into the Walgreens inside. A few cosmetics. Small things. The kind of purchases you make before a few days away from home. She paid at the counter and the register printed a receipt, time-stamped, ordinary, completely unremarkable. To the cashier, she was just another customer, calm, smiling, completely at ease. No sign of stress, no sign of fear, no sense that anything in her world was off. She tucked the receipt into her purse, pushed open the glass doors of the mall, and walked out into the bright July sun. Behind her, the store continued its business. Customers came and went. The cashier moved on to the next person in line. In front of her, Berit Beck simply vanished. That evening, David and Diane sat by the phone and waited. Barrett had promised to call as soon as she checked into the hotel. That was the plan. That was what she always did. So they waited, first an hour, then 2, then through dinner, then past dark. David checked the clock. Diane picked up the phone more than once just to make sure it had a dial tone. Nothing came. By the time they finally called the hotel themselves, the answer stopped them cold. Barrett had never checked in. Her room was still empty. The front desk had no record of her at all. They called her coworkers. They called her friends. They called everyone who might have heard from her. One by one, the answers came back the same. Nobody had seen her. Nobody had heard from her. She had simply stopped existing somewhere between that mall exit and the road to Appleton. The next morning, her seat at the seminar sat empty. And David and Diane Beck made the call no parent ever wants to make. They called the police. Barrett had been calm when she left that Walgreens. The receipt proved she had been there. The cashier confirmed she was fine. But somewhere out there, the family van was missing too. And nobody, not her parents, not the police, not anyone, had any idea yet what that van was about to tell them. The police were polite, they were calm, and they were not particularly concerned. Barrett was 18, she was an adult. Adults were allowed to change their plans, miss a hotel check-in, take an unexpected detour. There was no evidence of a crime, no signs of a struggle. No reason yet to treat this as anything more than a young woman who had gone somewhere unplanned. So they put out a notice with her description, and they waited. David and Diane Beck did not sleep. July 18th came and went without a single word. The seminar in Appleton started that morning with an empty seat. Her coworkers noticed. Her managers noticed. The hotel still had no record of her name. Barrett had simply stopped somewhere between that mall exit and the road north and left no trace of where. Her parents spent the day making calls that went nowhere. Friends, coworkers, anyone who might have heard something. Every answer came back the same. Nobody had seen her. Nobody had heard from her. And as the second night fell with still no word, the waiting stopped feeling like patience and started feeling like something much worse. Then, on July 19th, 2 days after Barrett vanished, a tip came in. A van matching the description had been sitting in a parking lot in Fond du Lac. Officers went to check. They found it almost immediately, parked in the Kmart lot, just a short walk from the Walgreens where Barrett had been seen 2 days before. It was the family van. Confirmed. The doors were locked. Not left open, not abandoned in a hurry with the door swinging. Locked. The way you lock a car when you are done with it and you are leaving deliberately. Whoever had left this van here had the keys. They had locked up behind themselves and walked away, which meant one thing that nobody said out loud yet. If the killer had the keys, where was Barrett? Investigators began working through the interior, and what they found turned a missing persons case into something far darker. The radar detector was gone. The stereo had been ripped out, taken, the kind of grab-and-go theft that happens in parking lots. The early instinct was robbery. Someone had broken in, grabbed the valuables, and left. That theory collapsed within minutes because Barrett's belongings were still inside. All of them. Her shoes, the ones on her feet when she left home, her dress, packed specifically for the seminar. Her clothes, her toiletries, everything she had brought for 3 days away. A thief willing to pull out a stereo does not leave a bag full of a young woman's personal items untouched. This was not a robbery. Something else had happened here. And then came the details that made the hair stand up. Cigarette ash. Thick piles of it. On the floor behind the front passenger seat, along the left side near the driver. Not a quick smoke from someone who stopped to rest. This was the kind of ash that builds up over hours. Whoever had been sitting in this van had been in it for a long time. Windows up, doors locked, just sitting and smoking in the dark while the upholstery absorbed the smell of every cigarette. The scent of stale tobacco was trapped deep in the fabric, a smell that had never belonged in this van. A smell that was not Barrett's. She did not smoke. Her family did not smoke. No one who had any legitimate reason to be in that van smoked. Someone had been locked inside this vehicle for hours, waiting or hiding or both. Then the clothing, a red shirt crumpled on the floor, torn. Not worn and tossed aside, but ripped. A pink dress laid across the seat, and a pair of pantyhose tied into a tight, deliberate knot. Not tangled the way things get when you pack in a hurry. Tied, the way you tie something when you mean to. Each item on its own could mean nothing. Together, they were telling investigators something they were not ready to hear. Then they found the ring. Kurt had given Barrett a sapphire ring, the kind she wore every single day, the kind the people closest to her said never left her finger. It was not on her hand because her hand was not there. But the ring was in the van. Tucked underneath the floor mat, not dropped, not rolled there by accident. A ring does not fall off a finger and land flat and hidden beneath a floor mat. It had been placed there deliberately. Now here was the detail that stopped everyone cold. The stereo was gone. The radar detector was gone. Whoever was in this van had no hesitation taking those. But a real sapphire ring, jewelry with actual value, had been carefully hidden instead of pocketed. Why? Was it a final desperate act? A girl who felt something was wrong, slipping her ring under the mat so someone would find it later? A last attempt to leave a trace? Or was it the cold calculation of someone playing a different kind of game entirely, hiding what they did not want found? That question had no answer yet, but it would not go away. 2 cups, one from McDonald's, one from Burger King. Investigators confirmed Barrett had made one food stop that morning, McDonald's. 1 stop, 1 cup, 1 receipt. She had never gone to a Burger King. There was no Burger King cup that belonged to her, but there it was, sitting in her van. And the fingerprints on it. Whose were they? Nobody knew yet. But the cup was bagged, tagged, and set aside. It would wait. Then came the number. Before Barrett left home, David Beck had written down the van's mileage, a few digits on a scrap of paper for a travel reimbursement form. Investigators pulled that number and held it against what the odometer now showed. The van had been driven 461 miles more than it should have been. Fond du Lac was roughly 100 miles from Sturtevant. Even with every stop accounted for, the math did not come close to working. Someone had taken this van and driven it far and for a long time before returning it to this parking lot 2 blocks from where Barrett was last seen alive. Investigators stood in that lot and looked at everything laid out in front of them. Locked doors, a hidden ring, ash from a stranger's cigarette soaked into the seats, a cup from a fast food place Barrett never visited, and 461 miles that no one could explain. Barrett was not in the van. Barrett was not nearby. Barrett was nowhere. And the person who had her keys had walked away from this parking lot like they had somewhere else to be. Within days of Barrett's disappearance, her face was everywhere. Flyers went up in post office lobbies, gas stations, and grocery store windows across Racine County. Her photo appeared on the sides of semi-trailers rolling down Wisconsin highways. Thousands of people driving past her smile every single day. A $75,000 reward was announced. Over 100 volunteers showed up to search, walking in long lines through fields and ditches across Fond du Lac County, pushing through tall grass in the August heat. The searches turned up nothing. Tips came in and went cold. Leads dried up one by one. Days turned into weeks, and the case that had started with urgency settled into the terrible quiet of an investigation with no forward movement. July ended, August began, and still nothing. On the morning of August 22, 1990, a farmer was driving a rural road outside Walpoon, Wisconsin, a small town a few miles from where the family van had been found abandoned weeks before. He noticed something in the ditch along the side of the road. He slowed down. He stopped. He got out and looked. No sirens, no screaming, just the sound of wind moving across a Wisconsin cornfield and a stillness that only comes when something is terribly, irreversibly wrong. He called the police. Officers arrived and found human remains. Weeks of summer heat had done what summer heat does. The passage of time had made identification impossible through traditional means. There was no quick answer, no immediate confirmation, just the slow, careful work of investigators collecting what could be collected from a roadside ditch while the Wisconsin sky sat flat and gray above them. The summer heat had stolen the answers the police desperately needed. Time of death, precise cause, the small physical details that build a case, much of it was simply gone. Dental records were pulled, comparisons were made, the remains were Berit Beck. She had been out there for weeks, lying in that ditch while her family searched, while her face traveled across the state on the sides of trucks, while her parents sat beside a phone that never brought the right call. She had been there the whole time, in the loneliness of that roadside ditch, a few miles from where her van was found, completely hidden from everyone looking for her. The medical examiner went to work with what remained. A precise cause of death could not be confirmed. That word, inconclusive, would follow this case for years, a quiet frustration sitting beneath every report and every hearing. But the examination pointed firmly in one direction. The evidence pointed toward a deliberate act that ended her life. The physical indicators were there, even if certainty was not. What the examiner could say with more confidence was the timeline. Based on the condition of the remains, Barrett had almost certainly been killed on July 17th, the same day she disappeared. The same day she walked out of that Walgreens with a small bag of cosmetics and the rest of her life ahead of her. She had not been held somewhere for days. She had not had time to find a way out. It ended on the same day it began. And then came the detail that reframed everything. The torn red shirt found crumpled on the floor of the van had been logged as evidence of a struggle, a sign of chaos, of something happening fast and violently. Investigators had noted it and moved on. But when the remains were examined, that assumption quietly collapsed. A piece of fabric had been used to ensure she could not see her surroundings. Someone, in the middle of whatever was happening to her, had stopped, taken that torn piece of fabric and tied it deliberately across the eyes of an 18-year-old girl. That was not panic. That was not the result of things spiraling out of control. That was a choice made calmly by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. And an item of clothing recovered from the vehicle, knotted so deliberately that investigators had flagged it weeks earlier. The medical examiner's findings gave that detail its full and terrible meaning. It had not been tied out of habit. It had been tied for a reason. The case was now a homicide. Officially, without any remaining doubt, investigators turned their focus inward, to the area around Fond du Lac, to men with histories that warranted attention. 5 to 7 persons of interest were identified. Interviews were conducted. Alibis were checked. Names were written down, followed up, and crossed off. None of them led to anything solid. The investigation moved through the fall of 1990 and into the following year without a meaningful break. Back in Sturtevant, Barrett's classmates at Case High School did what young people do when grief has nowhere else to go. They raised money through concerts and fundraisers and planted a cherry tree outside the school's music room, a living thing, rooted in the same ground where Barrett had played her violin. They announced a scholarship in her name, awarded each year to a student who wanted to study music after graduation. Something of her kept going, something that could not be taken. The tree grew. The scholarship continued. The case stayed open. But here is what no one knew yet. The killer had already left himself behind. Inside that van, on the day he took Barrett, he had left physical traces, real, tangible, and waiting. They had been collected. They had been bagged and labeled and placed into an evidence box. The problem was not that the evidence was missing. The problem was far simpler and far more maddening than that. Nobody had looked at it correctly yet, and nobody would for another 23 years. Quick pause here, because this is the part where most people forget to subscribe and then can't find the channel again. Don't be that person. Hit subscribe, leave a like if this story is hitting different, and tell me in the comments what you're thinking right now. And when this video ends, check the description. The next case down there is just as dark and just as real, and it will keep you up tonight. Now, back to the case. When an investigation has no answers, it looks for patterns. And in the months after Barrett's murder, a pattern emerged that seemed to fit almost perfectly. A man, call him Craig, had been active in the area around the time Barrett disappeared. He stole cars. Not for parts, not to flip quickly. He stole them and drove them. Long distances, hundreds of miles, sitting behind someone else's wheel until he was done, then abandoning the vehicle and walking away. It was his signature move. He was, in every practical sense, a perfect shadow of whoever had taken Barrett's van, someone who fit the outline without being the real shape inside it. Investigators took notice. Then Craig was arrested for robbing a bank. And when officers searched his belongings, they found something that made everyone stop. A hairbrush, a woman's hairbrush, with blonde hair tangled in the bristles. Berit Beck had blonde hair. This was 1990. DNA analysis existed in early form, but required weeks, specialized labs, and evidence in far better condition than a few strands in a hairbrush. There was no quick answer, no database to check in an afternoon. Investigators noted the brush, bagged it, and held on to it, but they could not prove what it meant. What came next felt like they might not need to. One of Craig's acquaintances came forward with a story. He told investigators that Craig had confessed, not a rumor, a direct admission, he claimed. Craig had described what he did. And more than that, he said Craig had taken him to the van and shown him Barrett's body inside before disposing of her. Investigators had been waiting for exactly this kind of break. A reported confession changes everything. It shifts resources, narrows focus, and tells an entire department that the answer is right in front of them. They just need to build the case around it. Craig became the prime suspect. The investigation reorganized itself around him completely, and then it hit a wall it could not get past. Craig's fingerprints did not match a single print found inside Barrett's van. Investigators had a collection of prints lifted from surfaces throughout the vehicle: a steering wheel, door panels, personal items, a coffee cup. Craig's prints were not among them, not one match. He denied everything. Denied knowing Barrett, denied being in Fond du Lac that day, denied every word of the confession his acquaintance had described. Without a fingerprint match and without a confession from Craig himself, prosecutors made the calculation that charging him and losing a trial meant he could never be charged again. So they held back. They kept Craig in their sights and kept looking for something stronger. That search lasted years. A decade passed, then most of another one. David and Diane Beck kept their vigil. Every July 17th, they drove to West Lawn Memorial Park and stood at their daughter's grave. The first anniversary, the 10th, the 15th, the 20th. The world moved on around them, and they kept returning to that same patch of ground on the same date because it was the only thing left they could do for her. They had been told, in careful words across careful conversations, that investigators had a suspect, that the case was not forgotten, that it was a matter of time. Time kept passing, and then, quietly, the story collapsed. The acquaintance who had come forward, the man who described Craig's confession in detail, who claimed Craig had shown him the body, admitted he had fabricated everything. He had a personal grudge against Craig, a private dispute that had curdled over years into something cold and deliberate. He had listened carefully when police spoke. He had picked up details about the case that were never made public, the kind of specific, verifiable details that make a story sound like it could only come from someone who was there. And he had built a lie around those details, precise enough and credible enough to redirect an entire murder investigation for years. An entire murder investigation, redirected, because one man wanted to settle a score. Craig had spent years as the prime suspect in a murder he had nothing to do with. The hairbrush, the matching pattern, the geography, all of it circumstantial, all of it pointing at a shadow while the real person stood in daylight, completely untouched. His name was Dennis Brantner. He lived in Kenosha, Wisconsin. He drove a truck for a living, had been doing it since 1979, rolling across state lines, through cities and small towns, through counties and jurisdictions that never knew his name. While investigators spent years watching Craig, Brantner went to work, came home, and existed in complete safety. And in an evidence box sitting in a Fond du Lac County building, his fingerprints were waiting, not in a computer, not in a searchable system. In 1990, fingerprint comparison was done by hand. Ink pressed onto paper cards, held under magnifying glasses by trained examiners, compared point by point against other cards in a physical file. It was slow, and it was limited to whoever investigators already had in mind to check. The prints from Barrett's van had been run against Craig and the other persons of interest. No match, so they were filed away. While the killer drove his truck across state lines, his identity was gathering dust in a basement. Nobody had asked the broader question. Nobody had taken those unmatched prints and run them against the wider world, against the national database that by the early 2000s was becoming powerful enough to find answers nobody had thought to look for yet. The answer had been sitting there for over a decade, waiting for someone who would finally ask the right question. That person was coming, but it would take until 2013 for him to arrive. In 2013, a local news station in Wisconsin ran a cold case segment. Berit Beck's story was one of them. A few minutes of airtime, an old photograph. The brief facts: a young woman, a family van, a ditch outside Walpun, 23 years without an answer. The kind of segment that airs on a slow news night, generates a handful of calls, and disappears by morning. But 2013 was not 1990. The world that existed between those two dates had been rebuilt from the ground up. Computers that once filled entire rooms now sat in pockets. Databases that once required weeks of manual cross-referencing could return results in hours. An investigator sitting at a desk in 2013 had tools that would have seemed like science fiction to the officers who first stood in that Kmart parking lot and tried to make sense of what they were looking at. One person watching that news segment understood exactly what that meant for an unsolved case with a box of old evidence sitting in storage. His name was Nate Lamont. In July of 1990, Lamont had been a dispatcher with the Fond du Lac County Sheriff's Office. He had been on the other end of those first calls. The missing woman, the abandoned van, the body in the ditch. He had heard this case develop in real time and watched it go cold. For more than 2 decades, he had carried it the way investigators carry the ones that never got resolved, quietly, persistently, like a splinter that never fully works its way out. When he saw that news segment, he made a decision. Lamont pulled the case file and started reading from the beginning. What he found did not take long to locate, and it stopped him completely. The fingerprints collected from Barrett's van in 1990 had been compared against Craig and the handful of early suspects. No match, and then they had been filed, pressed onto paper cards, placed in an envelope, put in a box, and shelved for 23 years while everything around them changed. AFIS, the Automated Fingerprint Identification System, was now a national digital database containing the prints of millions of people with criminal records. In 1990, fingerprint work meant a trained examiner holding a magnifying glass over a paper card, manually comparing ridge patterns against a limited set of known suspects. You could only find what you already knew to look for. The unmatched prints from Barrett's van had been checked against the people investigators were already watching. Nobody beyond that circle, nobody knew. Lamont submitted the prints to the Wisconsin Crime Lab. Within weeks, the system returned a match, 9 fingerprints, lifted from 5 separate items inside Barrett's van, all belonging to the same person. Dennis Brantner, Kenosha, Wisconsin. The name had never appeared in the case file, not once across 23 years of investigation. He was not in the notes. He was not in any interview record. He had never been a suspect, never been questioned, never been looked at in any capacity. He was a complete stranger to everyone who had spent decades trying to find out who killed Berit Beck. But his fingerprints had been in her van from the very first day. Lamont built a profile. The more he learned, the more the ground shifted beneath him. Brantner had been driving trucks since 1979, long-haul routes, cross-country miles, the kind of work that puts a man on the road through dozens of counties without anyone tracking his movements. His routes passed through Fond du Lac County regularly, and in the summer of 1990, he had been living in Green Lake, Wisconsin, roughly 30 miles from the ditch where Barrett's body was found. His record went back years: car theft, burglary, kind of history that puts a person's prints into the system in the first place. But one file entry made Lamont pause. In 1989, exactly 1 year before Barrett's murder, Brantner had stolen a Cadillac in Green Lake. He did not sell it, he drove it. More than 900 miles, alone, across long stretches of Wisconsin road. When police recovered the car, they found the same thing investigators had found in Barrett's van: large piles of cigarette ash pressed into the seats, ground into the floor, the kind of residue left by someone who sits in an enclosed space for hours with nowhere to be and nobody watching. Same behavior, same geography. 1 year earlier, and then 1994, Brantner had separated from his second wife. One evening, as she finished her shift and walked to her car, he was already inside it, hidden, waiting in silence until she got in. The moment she did, he produced a knife. He forced her to drive. He controlled where she went and what she did, and he held her against her will for hours. She eventually got free. He was arrested in Lake County, Illinois for unlawful restraint and battery. The car was not the target, the car was the trap. He used it the same way both times, as an enclosed space where a woman had nowhere to run and no one could hear her. For Brantner, a vehicle was not transportation, it was a hunting ground. In late March of 2014, investigators drove to Kenosha. They kept it calm, professional. They did not put everything on the table immediately. They asked questions and they watched his face. When they showed him a photograph of Berit Beck, his composure broke on the spot. The color left his face, his hands became unsteady. And then he began to cry, not the measured, slow grief of someone receiving difficult news, but the sudden, destabilizing collapse of someone ambushed by something they had spent years keeping buried. It was not sadness, it was exposure. He denied everything. He had never met her. He had never been in her van. He could not explain any of it. When investigators told him his fingerprints had been found on multiple items inside that vehicle, he could not produce an answer. He said he did not remember. He said he did not know how it was possible. And then, when they pressed him directly on whether he had harmed her, the denial he reached for came out fractured and incomplete. If I did, I did. And if I did, I don't know. Not an admission, not a denial. Something in between that told investigators everything they needed to know about what kind of man they were sitting across from. 9 fingerprints, 5 items, but one detail made the case impossible to talk around. Among those items was the cosmetics box, the products Barrett had purchased at the Walgreens inside Forest Mall on the afternoon of July 17, 1990. She had bought them that day, carried them out of the store, and placed them in the van. They were fresh purchases, handled only by her. That box was not an old item sitting in the glove compartment for months. It was not something passed between multiple people over time. It had been in Barrett's hands within the hour. For Brantner's fingerprints to be on it, he had not simply found the van after she left. He had found Barrett. He was there, at that mall, at that moment, close enough to touch what she was carrying on the last afternoon of her life. On the morning of March 27, 2015, Dennis Brantner walked out of the Kenosha County Courthouse. He had been inside for a hearing on an unrelated firearm charge. Just another court appearance, another Tuesday morning in a life that had continued completely undisturbed for 25 years. He pushed through the doors, stepped outside, and found Fond du Lac County detectives waiting for him on the other side. They arrested him on the spot. First-degree murder, Berit Beck, July 17, 1990. During the booking process at Fond du Lac County Jail, a deputy found something tucked inside Brantner's left boot, a bag containing 37 oxycodone pills, no prescription. Hidden from the detectives who had patted him down, carried across county lines without a word. 25 years after Barrett's murder, the man investigators believed had taken her life was still hiding things in his boots and hoping no one would check. Bond was set at $1 million cash. As the arrest became public, people who had worked alongside Brantner started coming forward. Three former co-workers from a Kenosha welding plant told investigators the same story independently. Brantner had kept a photograph clipped to the inside of his toolbox, a photo of a young blonde woman. He had told them she was his girlfriend. They had believed him, because why wouldn't they? But when Barrett's face appeared in news coverage of the arrest, they recognized her immediately. He had carried her photograph to work for years, shown it to colleagues, claimed her as his own, a girl he had murdered, whose family had spent decades not knowing what happened to her, whose name had been on scholarship certificates and memorial flyers and a grave in Mount Pleasant. And there was more. One coworker told investigators that Brantner had made deeply disturbing comments regarding the safety of a colleague's family member. He had said it like it was a passing thought, like it was the kind of thing a person could just say out loud at work and have it mean nothing. It meant everything. The trial began in the summer of 2016. More than 2 weeks of testimony, more than 40 witnesses. The prosecution laid out the fingerprint evidence, the behavioral pattern, the 1989 Cadillac theft with its matching cigarette ash, the 1994 kidnapping of his wife, the photograph in the toolbox. They built the case piece by piece and asked the jury to see what investigators had concluded, that Dennis Brantner had been in that van and that no innocent explanation existed for how he got there. But the defense had a weapon the prosecution could not fully counter. The state crime lab had lost evidence. The jacket, gone. The Burger King cup carrying Brantner's fingerprint, gone. Key physical items that had been collected from the van in 1990, cataloged and entrusted to the state's own facility, had simply disappeared from storage over the decades. The defense stood in front of the jury and asked the question that prosecutors had no clean answer to. If the evidence was so solid, where was it? If the fingerprints were so damning, why couldn't they be retested, reconfirmed, re-examined by an independent expert today? The state's own system had failed Berit Beck a second time. The jury deliberated for 3 days. Notes went back and forth to the judge. One juror became ill and spent a night in the emergency room. The foreperson sent word that they could not agree, not on guilt, not on innocence, just a room full of people who could not reach the same conclusion together. Judge Gary Sharp declared a mistrial. The district attorney announced immediately that he would retry the case. Like preparing for a second trial uncovered a legal trap that no one wanted to navigate. Because of how Wisconsin's statute of limitations applied to the specific charges in this case, a conviction on a lesser charge, rather than first-degree intentional homicide, carried the risk that Brantner could use the limitation period to avoid any additional punishment entirely. The law, written for a different era, had not accounted for cases that took 25 years to reach a courtroom. The prosecution faced a choice with no good options: push for the full charge and risk losing everything, or find another path. After long, painful consultations with Barrett's family, they found one. In February of 2018, Dennis Brantner stood before Judge Robert Wirtz in Fond du Lac County and entered an Alford plea. Under an Alford plea, a defendant does not admit guilt. They simply acknowledge that the evidence against them is strong enough that a jury would likely convict. Brantner accepted a sentence for second-degree reckless homicide, a charge that carried a maximum of 10 years. He never said he did it, not once, not in the interview room in 2014, not in the courtroom in 2018. The closest he ever came was a fractured half sentence in a police interview: "If I did, I did." 10 years. That was the sentence Judge Wirtz handed down, the maximum allowed under the charge. Before delivering it, the judge looked at Dennis Brantner and said the words plainly: "The public needs to be protected from you." The 10-year sentence would run consecutively, meaning it would not begin until after Brantner finished serving 6.5 years for the oxycodone charges. Under Wisconsin's older sentencing laws, he would be eligible for parole after just 2.5 years into the murder sentence. If parole was denied at every hearing, he would be released at approximately 75 years old. District Attorney Eric Toney stood in the courthouse and told reporters what he actually felt. In almost every respect, 10 years feels too little. The Beck family sat through all of it. Ben Beck, Barrett's brother, who had said goodbye to his sister that same July morning without knowing it was the last time, spoke at the sentencing hearing. His voice carried everything that 28 years of waiting had built up. This was a slow, horrible torture that no family should have to endure. Would she be a wife, a mother, a career woman, a professional musician? We will never know. David Beck. The man who had stood at his front door on a summer morning and waved as his daughter drove away paused several times while speaking to hold back tears. "After 27 years," he said, "there is no preparation you can make for this day." Outside Case High School in Sturtevant, a cherry tree stands in the courtyard near the music room. It has been there since 1991, planted by Barrett's classmates on what would have been her 19th birthday in the place where she used to play her violin. Every year, the Berit Beck Memorial Music Scholarship is awarded to a student at Case High School who plans to study music after graduation. The concert that raises money for it has run for decades. A second tree grows at the Racine County Fairgrounds, planted by her 4-H club members who needed somewhere to put what they were feeling. Her grave at West Lawn Memorial Park still receives visitors every July 17th. On the morning she left home, Berit Beck turned back at the door with a smile and told her father not to worry. All the people up north are good people. She was 18 years old and she believed that completely. She had no reason not to. The man who proved her wrong never once admitted what he did. He took a legal exit that let him walk away without saying the word guilty out loud. He will be free before most people have finished paying off a car loan. But every spring, a student at Case High School walks across a stage and receives a scholarship with Barrett's name on it. Every year, that cherry tree outside the music room puts out new growth. And somewhere in the quiet of a Wisconsin morning, in the memory of everyone who knew her and the many more who only learned her name through a cold case file, Barry's music plays on.